Do you know the world's best footballer, Saylaw? What about Yàlǐshìduōdé? You probably do know them, even though you might not realize it. Hello and welcome to the Hacking Chinese podcast. In this week's episode, we are going to talk about names in Chinese and how we label things in the world. And we will see that this is quite different between different languages, and sometimes that causes some trouble. To get us started, I have recorded a small dialogue, and I will first play the dialogue in Chinese, and I will then explain it in English, or render an English version of it rather.
那个男生长得跟 C 罗一模一样耶。
跟谁一模一样？
C 罗踢足球的那个啊。
谁？
你不知道吗？他是现在最有名的球星啊，葡萄牙的那个，你肯定知道。
你是说 Ronaldo 吗？ So this type of situation can also occur in English, so this is an English rendering of the same thing, and it works both ways, so you can listen to either or both. That guy looks exactly like Saylaw. Like who? Saylaw, the football player, you know. Who? He's one of the most famous players of all time, from Portugal. I'm sure you know about him. You mean Ronaldo? This dialogue is of course made up, but I've experienced hundreds of situations like this, either when speaking English with Chinese people or when speaking Chinese with Chinese people. So let's just sort out what's going on here before I actually zoom out and kind of talk about the actual issue. So who is the mysterious Saylaw? Now, if you love football, this is maybe not a surprise to you, but Cristiano Ronaldo, the Portuguese football player, is usually referred to as Saylaw in Chinese. And the point is that this label, this name that he has, is so different from what most people are used to if we speak English, that we would be unable to link this name to the person in question. And this is what happened in the dialogue. If you hear someone express that they think that Saylaw is the most famous football player of all time, you'd be a bit surprised because you'd think like, Saylaw, who's that? Where is he from? I've no idea about this guy. And then it turns out it's a person you actually know who it is. And even if you're not into football, you probably know who he is anyway. And this looks very weird if you just look at it. Saylaw, okay, what's that got to do with Ronaldo or Cristiano Ronaldo? It's not as weird as it seems, actually. There are many football players called Ronaldo after all. I looked at Wikipedia and there are 11 of them, most of them Brazilian. So if there are 11 people called Ronaldo that you might want to talk about, it's not very useful to just call them Ronaldo, right? So in Chinese we have the luo, which is the first syllable of Ronaldo, although with an L instead of an R because, well, reasons. And the C, of course, is for Cristiano here. So if we have Saylaw, it's Ronaldo. Okay, that's kind of makes sense, right? It only makes sense if you know about it, though. If this is the first time you hear this name being pronounced, it's very likely that you don't understand who's being referred to, which is what this podcast episode is about, exactly this type of problem. So essentially, the problem is that when we listen or read a language, we need to know certain things in advance. Like, yes, sure, we can extract certain amounts of information from the text or speech itself, but this text and speech doesn't itself contain everything that we need to know to make sense of it. People will refer to things that you need to know all the time, and they usually don't think about it. And the only time you do think about it is when it's in a foreign language like Chinese, and people use labels that are so different that you don't get them. And this is particularly pronounced when it comes to names. So the key issue I want to talk about here is not that there are things about the Chinese language that you don't know. That's obvious, and all of us have lots of things that we don't know. But I'm saying that there are things that you think that you know, and that you do know, in fact, for example, who Ronaldo is in this case, but that is not accessible because the label being used is different. And of course, it could be said that that's true for basically any word that, signifies anything in the world, that you don't know the link because you don't know the word in Chinese. It's just that with names, this problem becomes very pronounced because it's something we just assume works. And with most language combinations, this actually just works pretty well. You just pronounce it with, a slight foreign accent when you say it in the other language. So, for example, I will say that I live in Stockholm, but no one in Sweden says Stockholm. The city is called Stockholm. But they are pretty close. One is just said with an English accent, right? So that is fine, and that is usually not different enough that it will cause labeling issues, that someone will not realize that I'm talking about the same city. as was the case with Ronaldo here and Saylaw. So this can happen in two types of situations. First is when you listen to a Chinese person speaking in Chinese, and they might refer to something that you actually know what it is, but the practical effect is that you don't know because they use a name that you're not familiar with. So they might be talking about this Saylaw and you simply don't know who it is. But in actuality, if they would have said Cristiano Ronaldo instead, you would be able to follow the conversation because you know what they are referring to. So not being able to access this kind of prior knowledge, which the speaker typically counts on you being able to do, can be detrimental to communication in general and just usually means you simply have no clue what they're talking about. This can also happen when you speak Chinese yourself as opposed to hearing someone else speak it, and you want to use something, you want to refer to a person or a country, and you don't know how that's said in Chinese. Now, depending whom you're talking to, this can, of course, still work. Like if I say Stockholm to some Chinese people, they will know that that is the capital of Sweden. Now, naturally, people who live here knows that, and maybe some other people do too. But anyone who has spoken lots of Chinese with Chinese people and talked about the world will know that if you use the pronunciation in that language, many Chinese people will simply not understand what you're talking about. And an example of this, although I haven't experimentally tested this, would be Ronaldo then. So if you say Cristiano Ronaldo, Chinese people would sometimes be less likely to understand what you're saying compared to if you just say Saylaw, which is a normal way of saying it. Of course, there are people who are interested in football or maybe care more about this, who knows what his full name is and what his name is in Portuguese, but I wouldn't bet on it. If you've studied Chinese for a while, you already know this, but I still want to go through the basics here. The reason that these names are rendered in what we would consider strange ways in Chinese is because that we need to write foreign names with Chinese characters using syllables that are actually part of the sound inventory of Mandarin in this case. So while we in English can just take a name in, say, Portuguese and just write it in English and pronounce it in something in a way that makes sense to us, that we can't do that in Chinese, or that's not the way it's done. Instead, you choose characters that closely or as closely as possible match the pronunciation of the name. And because Mandarin only has some 400 syllables, this means that our options are quite limited, and sometimes the result is therefore not very close to the original name. That's not always the case, though. Some of them are actually very good. So, for example, if someone says that they love the music of Beethoven, you should be able to figure out that that's Beethoven. It's actually very close to the original pronunciation. Or if someone says that they work in Panama, you should be able to figure out that that's Panama. It's not that the pronunciation is different enough that it would cause problems. Maybe if you've never heard anyone outside of your native language pronounce these things, it could be tricky to realize that people across the world pronounce names slightly differently. But for most people, I don't think that these cases would cause lots of trouble. Sometimes the names in Chinese are also very unintuitive, and that is usually because they didn't come into the Chinese language via Mandarin, but some other topolect. A good example of this is Sweden in Chinese, which is Ruidian. And this doesn't make much sense in Mandarin, and you can easily see that you could have chosen other characters that would more closely match the pronunciation. And that is because this was not done in Mandarin, but instead in a southern dialect where the pronunciation actually is quite close to Sweden. And then, of course, Sweden is not what we call the country in Swedish, it's called Sverige, and this is something I will return to later. It's also worth noting that there might be differences in how a certain name is rendered in Chinese depending on if you're in Taiwan, Hong Kong, or mainland China. So that means that transcription can be different, so the pronunciation is written in different ways in different places. So for example, the country Nigeria is Nǐrìlià in Chinese, that's mainland standard, but in Taiwan it's Naijilià instead. This also goes for names of other kinds, such as translations of, say, book titles or film titles, although that is slightly beyond the scope of this podcast episode. So let's talk about who is right and who is wrong in this debate, like who decides what you can call something. And if you're a person, you can probably decide yourself how you think that people should pronounce your name, and you can maybe claim that speakers of a language should be able to decide how their names are pronounced, or the names of their capital or country or whatever. That's not how it works in practice, though. Speakers of a language will call things whatever they want, and it's certainly the case that they won't call people from, say, Sweden and ask, "Are you okay with us calling you this?" And one thing that is even more obvious is that no one will care about us second language learners when they decide these things. So we have no say in this, we just have to deal with it. However, I want to point out that there is a real risk of being Anglo-centric here, or if you're not a native speaker of English, then centric to whatever other area you are from. And that is that we tend to think that the names that we use for things are more reasonable than other people's ways of doing it, including sometimes the actual country of origin of this place or person. And this is a little bit like the animal noises, We think it's hilarious that Chinese people think that dogs say Wang, which sounds odd to us, but of course what we think that dogs say sounds equally weird to Chinese people. So this is just a matter of preference, and it's hard to say who's right and wrong. And even if we can say who's right and wrong, that's not how it works. People don't care, they just say whatever they say. And let's look at a few examples that are interesting for one reason or another. And sometimes, of course, the English is not very close, and English can actually cause trouble for second language learners. Including English speakers, of course, if you then study another language where this name is closer to the original version. And so the first example here is Aristotle, which I've encountered problems with several times. I've met Swedish people who don't understand who Aristotle is, and that's because in Swedish his name is Aristoteles, which is reasonably close to the ancient Greek original. It is spelled exactly the same way, in fact. In Chinese, this is Yàlǐshìduōdé, and I'm not sure if you think that sounds closer to the ancient Greek or to English or whatever. But we can see here that these names are quite different, and it's not just a problem for Chinese speakers normally, it can be a problem otherwise too. And then, of course, we have the case of countries that have very different names in different languages. So in English, we call the country Germany, and everybody knows what Germany is. But in German, it's not Germany, it's Deutschland. And in Chinese, it's Deguo, which is arguably closer to Deutschland than Germany. I mean, it has the D at the beginning. And in Swedish, just for reference, we call the country Tyskland, which is again very different. So if you've learned that it's called Tyskland and you learn English, you then have to learn that it's called Germany, but none of these are actually what Germans themselves call their country. So it's not like one is more right than the other. We just have to learn how different languages prefer to do it. It's worth noting that in Chinese, we also have a kind of interesting example when it comes to some names, especially in Japanese, where the characters, the way they are written, can actually be identical, although the pronunciation is not. So Japan in Chinese is, of course, 日本, and it's written with those two characters. And in Japanese, it's Nihon, written with the same two characters, but obviously not pronounced the same. Now, the reason I think this is interesting is that names are used quite a lot, and when we speak our native language, we throw names around a lot, and we assume that people understand what we mean. And this kind of breakdown that we've been talking about in this podcast episode doesn't really happen in your native language. Of course, it could be that someone doesn't know what something is called, or it could also be that people refer to the same thing with different words or names. But in general, this doesn't happen. It just happens when you learn a foreign language. And it happens a lot when you speak Chinese or listen to Chinese, because as we have seen, the labeling is quite different. And that can kind of negate your prior knowledge about how the world works and everything. In some cases, this is not a big problem. In the dialogue that we listened to earlier, that's a friendly discussion, and the problem was found out. Me in this case figured out that it was about Ronaldo and Saylaw and all that. But in most cases, when you listen, if you miss something like this, it's just likely that you think that it's something you have no clue what it is. Not just that you have the wrong name, but you actually don't know about the thing being referred to. Often, of course, you cannot ask for clarification, and you might not even realize that you need to ask for clarification. So let's round this off on a practical note, because, of course, while it's interesting to talk about these things, the phenomena themselves, I also think it's important to be practical and see how we can deal with this, because it does cause a lot of frustration. I have been frustrated many times, either by not understanding something I really ought to understand, or when speaking Chinese, that there is something very particular that I want to refer to, but I can't do it because I know it. I know the name in another language than Chinese, and the Chinese person I'm talking to doesn't realize what it is in Chinese, and then we cannot talk about it. And you have to look it up in a dictionary, and then you can do it. So what to do? Well, I've identified 3 things that I think are practically applicable. The first one is that when you speak with a second language learner of your native language, so not when you are speaking Chinese, but when, say, a Chinese person is speaking to you, or indeed someone from another culture. I mean, this is hacking Chinese, so we talk about Chinese more, and I'm talking in English, so those 2 languages will be involved. But you get my point. If you are talking with someone who is not a native speaker of your language, realize that if you refer to something and they seem to not be able to understand what you mean, it could very well be that they do know about it, but they just can't connect to it because you use different names. And this is very true when you talk to people from China. So if you have an educated Chinese person and you say something like Aristotle, you can be reasonably sure that they know who the Greek philosopher is, because Chinese people in general are fairly well educated about our philosophy, our culture and all that, history and so on, whereas we tend to not be that educated in theirs. So they will know who Aristotle is, but they might not know him if you call him Aristotle. The second takeaway is that when you speak Chinese yourself and you want to refer to something and you're not sure about the Chinese name, well, first, of course, it's nice to learn the Chinese name, but provided that you don't know it, it can actually sometimes work if you just guess. So let's assume that you don't know how to say Nigeria in Chinese. I know I said how to say it earlier in this episode, but let's say you've forgotten about that or you don't know about it for some reason. You can just make something up that follows Chinese phonology on the fly. Like you use syllables that you know exist in Mandarin and you try to get fairly close to the original pronunciation. And this practically actually does work sometimes. I've done this many times. I say something in the original language or in English and the person does not understand. I then render my kind of fake Chinese transcription of the name and they are able to understand. They then correct my tones or something that wasn't quite right, and so on and so forth. And then we know what it is about and we can talk about it. Of course, there are official tables for transliteration or transcription into Chinese characters that you can look up if you want to, so certain sounds are usually transcribed in certain ways and so on. If you've studied Chinese for a while, you might even have internalized some of these without actually trying to, so your attempt at making up a Chinese name might actually be quite successful. Whereas as a beginner, this would be almost impossible. The third practical takeaway is that if you're serious about learning Chinese, you need to educate yourself in Chinese. And I don't mean that you need to learn about Chinese language itself, grammar and vocabulary and so on. You obviously need that too. But when it comes to names, you need to know how Chinese people talk about things outside of China. And the best way I think to do that is to listen to people do it, of course, and talk with them. You can study textbooks. So for example, world history, geography, things like that in Chinese. You can learn about science in Chinese, so you learn about all the names involved there, and you can watch talk shows where they talk about celebrities outside of China, and maybe programs where they analyze American politics and they mention all the politicians' names and so on and so forth. Whatever you are interested in. Okay, so in this episode I have shared examples that I have encountered. I have of course many more, but it would be interesting to hear what breakdowns in communication you have experienced because of the issue with names and how they are rendered in different languages. So if you have such a story, chat me up on social media, send me an email, leave a comment on Hacking Chinese or whatever you prefer. I'll see you again next week. Thank you for tuning in to the Hacking Chinese podcast. If you like this episode, please share it. More information and inspiration about learning and teaching Chinese can be found at hackingchinese.com. See you in the next episode, and until then, good luck with your studies.